Just a big pleasure for me to introduce John Petersen from Oberlin College in Oberlin, Ohio. John is the Paul Sears Distinguished Director of Environmental Studies and the longtime Director of the Environmental Studies program at Oberlin. He did his undergrad there, followed by a master's in forest sciences in forest hydrology and a PhD in systems ecology at the University of Maryland at College Park. John has been at Oberlin since 2000, and though he trained initially as an aquatic ecosystem ecologist, studying the role of energy feedback in planktonic ecosystems, his more current research, which he's going to tell you about today, has transitioned to thinking about feedback in human systems. I'll let John tell you about some of his great work, but I'll just suffice it to say that he has been a major contributor to discussions and research on sustainability and environmental education, both at Oberlin and more broadly. As a PI, he has secured a number of external grants, including an EPA P3 grant, NSF funding to develop methods in sustainability education, a 4-year Great Lakes Protection Fund grant, and a Schmidt Foundation grant on full spectrum sustainability. And I can also say from personal experience that John is a fantastic teacher and mentor. I was his advisee when I was an undergraduate at Oberlin, and he's the reason that I'm an ecologist now. He teaches a variety of classes, including most commonly Introduction to Environmental Studies, Systems Modeling, and Systems Ecology, and they're fantastic, and everyone at Oberlin knows it. So without further ado, I will let John give his talk.
What a very kind introduction Jake has given, and thank you so much for inviting me here. Thanks especially to Kimberly Long for doing a lot of organizational work around this, Janine Kadendervar and Jake Grossman for inviting me here to talk with you folks. So I'm very excited to be here today to share with you what we've learned and developed as both a technology and an approach for combining public displays of real-time resource flows in organizations and in whole communities with community voices with the goal of engaging, educating, motivating, empowering, and celebrating environmental stewardship occurring at the community level and at the organization level. And just to follow up a little bit on Jake, I'd like to thank our funding sources. Our largest funding source actually for this project has been the Great Lakes Protection Fund, which has given us $1 million to develop this technology, with the goal of this technology being implemented throughout Great Lakes communities. And so part of what I hope to do today here is to begin to cultivate people who might look at how this kind of technology might play out in their own community. So I'm looking forward to having a good discussion about that after you've heard what this is. I should also thank our partners, Lucid, who have been involved in co-developing the technology. This is a company that was started by former students. I should point out that several components of what I talk about today are off-the-shelf, commercially available technologies, and then several components are kind of in prototype phase, but basically at a stage where they're ready to be implemented in other communities. And I guess the last figure on the bottom I'll point out is the Great Lakes College Association, which has recently funded us to expand this into 4 other college communities. So we do have a little bit of traction elsewhere. Here's kind of an outline of where I want to head, and I may talk fairly quickly because I know I have 30 minutes and I've been told I want to keep within that so we can have a good discussion. I want to provide a little bit of context, talk about the technology, talk about some of the applications and research involved. Oops, I've got research on there twice. I wanted to emphasize that. But let me start by setting really, really broad context for what we're talking about here. And this may seem like a really strange slide to have up here. But the point I want to make with these images is that for greater than 99.9% of the 50,000 years of modern human evolution, human beings lived in a situation in which we received intimate and direct feedback from the natural world around us. That is, our ability to succeed, to perpetuate our genetic information, was very much based on how well we responded to these environmental cues in ways that allowed us to gather food, fuel, and fiber that made for successful society. That is most of our evolutionary history. you fast forward to this little blip of time that we're in right now, and the statistic is that North Americans now spend more than 90% of their lives within buildings. So obviously what that means is that this connection that we evolved with nature is now very separated. So we live in a world that's very, very different from the one that we evolved in. And some people, myself included, might argue that part of this sort of challenge we face of bringing about a more sustainable relationship between humans and the rest of the natural world is at least in some way premised on bringing these feedbacks back in. Maybe not the same kinds of feedbacks, our ancestors were directly experiencing the environment, but can we somehow leverage technology to improve our understanding and ability to react in real time to the natural resources on which human society is still fundamentally predicated. So it's not the case that feedback has disappeared. If we look at the systems in our world, within ecology, obviously, ecological relationships are still governed by feedback. We can create maps of relationships between organisms, trophic levels, that still can be described in terms of feedback. And it's very much also the case that as social organisms, we could map out human relationships in the same way in terms of feedback relationships. And likewise, and increasingly so, the technologies in our lives are involving increasingly sophisticated modes of feedback in which decisions are being made through technology to self-regulate our built environment and other technologies that in some ways are designed to enhance performance. But the point I want to make is that today, as opposed to in our previous existence, these feedbacks actually exist as sort of isolated, separated components and not as unified components. Indeed, many of the building technologies that are being developed now do as much to separate us from the natural world by making these decisions as they do to connect us. And so there's a group of folks out there developing new ways of thinking about these relationships. Some people have termed the study of the combination of these feedbacks sociotechnical feedback, to emphasize it involves both technology and people. And other people have been using the term ecofeedback to emphasize the way in which technology might be used to enhance our understanding and our ability to respond to conditions in the natural world. So that's sort of the context in which we're trying to develop technology. It's different from previous technologies in this sense. The kind of fundamental question that's animated our work on this is, how can we leverage the power of feedback to motivate and empower social, ecological, and economic transformation? Can we use feedback to try to bring about this stronger drive towards sustainability? And in many ways, if we think about there being a central goal in our work, it's an integrated technology and an approach that builds systems thinking and action. So systems thinking is a way of conceptualizing the world that emphasizes connections and interrelationships between parts. So someone who is a systems thinker is someone who conceives of themselves as an important and integral component of a larger whole. How can we foster that using technology? The rest of what I have on here is really sort of corollaries to this concept of systems thinking. So our goals are to foster the sense of connectedness and belonging to both social and ecological, and to a lesser extent, economic place. To situate individual decision-making in this larger community context. To try to share and celebrate pro-environmental thought and action that's already taking place within communities. And I'll say a little bit more about this, but there's very strong evidence from social psychology that celebrating pro-environmental behavior is a good way to get people to exhibit that behavior. Positively changing behavior and advancing sustainability and resilience is really, at the end of the day, what we hope this systems thinking brings about. So we are not the first people to imagine that feedback may have an important role to play in improving resource consumption behavior. In general, people have found that about 50%, most of the work that's been done has been done on residential electricity use so far. And people have found that somewhere around 50% of the electricity consumption within residential buildings can be controlled through human behavior. The other 50% is sort of background. It can be controlled through modifying the technology, but not directly through human behavior. There have been a variety of studies. One of the better meta-analyses of these studies was conducted by the ACEEE a couple years back, trying to look at what you can expect to conserve by introducing feedback on electricity use into the built environment. And these are some pictures of some of the different techniques that have been used. Some of you may receive bills that look like the one on the left. That's a bill from Opower, a company that's really kind of leveraged the power of social norms as an instrument for motivating conservation. The one on the right is a very primitive and early gauge that you could buy for your household that would display how much electricity you were using and translate it into dollars. But there's some really important caveats to the 4 to 12% electricity savings that people have observed as a general outcome of introducing feedback. One of those is that there's lots and lots of data to show that simply providing people with information does not necessarily change behavior. We often think that people are principally motivated by economics, but there's also very good evidence to show that information plus economic incentives also does not necessarily change behavior. And we have to sort of deal with the reality that because we're so separate from resource flows, those resource flows are often expressed in units that don't have a whole lot of psychological meaning to us. Most people do not understand what a kilowatt hour is or the difference between a kilowatt hour and a kilowatt. And even something like gallons, once you start talking about large numbers, people get confused by that. So the bottom line here in our thinking on this is that you really need a sophisticated messaging and very sophisticated psychological packaging in order to effectively motivate people to conserve resources. And so what I'm going to show next is kind of a summary of what makes socio-technical feedback effective based on reviews of the literature, but also on some of our own research here. Part of what makes it effective is that the information needs to be easily accessible. You need to have that information, and that information basically needs to be in your face, in your space, so you're actually receiving that information. It needs to be information that is actionable. You can do something with the information. And by tight feedback cycle, what I'm talking about is you get information on a time scale and at a spatial resolution that resonates with your ability to do something about it and resonates with your ability to think deeply about it. So accessibility, leveraging the power of social norms. I've already said that while people assume economics principally drive our behavior, the reality is overwhelmingly that people are most motivated by what other people are doing or what they perceive other people are doing. So making information socially comparative, being competitive is part of being socially comparative, being able to compare within your group, across groups, these are the things that are most motivational to people. Another key aspect is that it'll come as a shock to most of you that most of the decisions we made are not made based on rational thought processes. They're based on emotions. We make a lot of decisions. We need to be able to make them quickly. Emotions are a tool that we evolved to use to make decisions. So finding ways of presenting information in ways that are emotionally resonant with us, that connect individual and group consumption decisions with social and ecological consequences. Okay, so those are three keys, and now I want to talk a little bit about the technology, the pieces of the technology. So there are three components of what we've been developing. One is called Building Dashboard. That monitors and displays resource use within individual buildings. Citywide Dashboard does the same thing at the scale of whole organizations and whole communities. And then Community Voices combines images with words to try to foster pro-environmental behavior. I'm going to talk about each of those. I just wanted to throw them out there as the central components of the system. Conveying that to the audience, again, making the information accessible is critical. You see digital signage is key to that. So you're putting the information in people's face, in their space. Lots of rich content on website as well. I'll say more about that. Another component, which I will not talk about in this talk, but I just wanted to indicate this is part of what we've been working on, is something called Building OS, which is designed, most of what I'm going to talk about is oriented towards a non-technical public. The Building OS component of this is a very sophisticated set of analytical tools that we've been developing that allow facilities managers to really figure out, to access information from lots of different sources and to use analytical tools to figure out how to save resources. All right, so let me just kind of describe now how the feedbacks, because this is a layered feedback approach here, how the feedbacks work in this system. So we have people, they're making decisions, choices. Those choices are affecting the environment. Obviously, the environment affects people. So you've got this sort of flow of effect here that is just sort of the background reality of our world. What we've been doing is adding in feedback to this. So taking those choices and through metering technology and display technology, adding in a way for people to immediately in real time see the impact of their decision making within individual buildings. So that's kind of the building dashboard component of that. In the last 5 years, we've been expanding this to a whole community level. So monitoring resource flows within entire communities, organizations, or cities, and adding that as feedback. That's the Citywide dashboard component. And then finally, the last component is combining that with interviews and texts. This is less technological and more about real humans taking real action, but adding that information as part of this feedback. So those are the sort of 3 levels of feedback that are embodied in what we're doing here. All right, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about where our data comes from, but I know some of you think a lot about data, and so I just wanted to help you understand where it does come from very quickly. So far, and I'm going to talk now a little bit about the Oberlin pilot here, so where our data comes from in the city of Oberlin. So far, a lot of our work is involved installing monitoring equipment to monitor electricity and water flows using data loggers and sensor technology. As we move forward, we're trying to take increasing advantage of data that already exists for other people's purposes. That is, leverage all of this information that will soon be available all over the country through the smart grid, the interconnectedness of meters. This will make what we're doing a whole lot easier because it'll mean it'll become strictly a data flow issue as opposed to a technological installation issue. We can take advantage of those smart meters. At the whole city level, we've worked with our municipality and we're working with other municipalities to access data. So we have sensors installed in wastewater, freshwater. Mostly we're tapping into their existing system, their supervisory control automated data acquisition system, SCADA system, to access data on whole community electricity flows, wastewater treatment, freshwater treatment, so we can access that data. We've added some additional sensors at the wastewater treatment plant in our local watershed so we can monitor and display water quality upstream and downstream in real time as well as part of the display. All right, so I'm now going to say a little bit about each of the different components of environmental dashboard. So building dashboard is the piece of this that is farthest along in terms of development and commercialization. This technology is installed in thousands of buildings across the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand right now. Every public school, for instance, in DC has a display that looks like that. Again, you'll see part of the pieces of what I talked about. So this is a time series graph. You can get online. This is just a screenshot of something on a website. If you drag your mouse through this, what you would see is that character on the right, which we call an empathetic gauge, because it's translating technical data into a form that is emotionally resonant. A lot of research went into the development of that squirrel there. So you can see when resource use is highest. The squirrel, if it gets really high, the squirrel will actually shed tears at some point when it gets real high. But you get the idea here. This is technology that's designed to give you information about resource use within your particular building. So that's part of it. I don't want to talk about the interface too much, but there's a lot here that kind of leverages various components. Here's where you would choose what building you want to look at and widgets. But I do want to say a little bit about some of the social psychology I talked about earlier. The socially comparative point. How am I doing now relative to yesterday? The gray line is yesterday. The orange line is today. So you get this sense of patterns and where I fit relative to where I normally fit, so you can detect anomalous behavior. How am I doing relative to others? We've done a lot of work on competitions, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment for the socially comparative part. Competitions. Social networking, the technology is very integrated with Facebook in particular. Public commitments. Social psychology teaches us that when people make a public commitment, they're much more likely to follow through on it. So we've integrated that into the technology so people can make these commitments online and then they appear. The empathetic characters I've talked about. Unit conversion, the ability for people to express that resource consumption in different currencies, in dollars and CO2 emissions in the empathetic gauge. Those are all sort of components of the technology here. The ability to budget your resource consumption in the way you might budget your money. Again, I don't have time to talk about those in detail, and I definitely don't have time to talk much about the back end, but just to point out that we do have a lot of clients out there. Google has a building dashboard installed, Sony, these other companies are all using the building dashboard component of this and the analytical tools. A lot of our focus has gone into integrating with building automation technology so we can easily extract data from Siemens, Johnson Controls, Honeywell, these other folks who meter things but don't necessarily communicate with each other or present the data in a form that's easily accessible. All right. So part 2 is Citywide dashboard. Again, this is this kind of animated display of electricity and water use and environmental quality within whole communities. So here's an image of a community. How do we translate that? How do we take these invisible flows that are taking place in the environment that are largely out of sight and out of mind in terms of the decisions people make at work, at home, in schools? How do we translate that into a form that's meaningful and resonant to people? So here's what that looks like, that translation process. So this is this kind of animated conceptual model of a whole community. The gauges on the right there, and again, this is just a screenshot from a website, which you can access. The gauges on the right show you how much resources are being consumed in real time right now by residents of this particular community. And I'll kind of quickly walk you through some of the components here. So we have our wastewater plant, freshwater treatment plant, power station, the dominant businesses, the dominant organizations within a community, green space. And front and center, we've put a house that is designed to represent the decisions that you make in your home, in your workplace. So the whole idea here is to situate your consumption in this larger community context. So you see your acts within your home and workplace as larger acts of citizenship that affect this larger community and are reflected on the gauges. I'll give you a little walkthrough of what these different sections look like. We have the animated character here who can give different information depending on different levels of resource use. So there's a whole sort of database of messages that the squirrel might give you based on your current consumption patterns, current patterns of the environmental conditions. All right, so again, a sort of video shot like this doesn't really do justice. If you go to the website, you'll see the whole site sort of animates based on resource flows. So that's electricity, water. We have a different character. It's Flash the Energy Squirrel as the squirrel, and Wally Walleye for water. That fish is quite amazing in what it can do. Watershed, weather conditions, etc. So one of the things we've been working on is a prototype. We designed this so buildings could be easily swapped out. So for instance, we could take the dominant city and organizations and swap them out for other things. So here's our San Francisco version with a particular organization. We've been working with schools in Toledo recently. So this is the city of Toledo and the Toledo Public Schools. We've got dashboard in Toledo Public Schools now. Okay, so third and last part I want to talk about is community voices. This is the component of environmental dashboard that focuses on combining pictures and words that we extract from interviews with community members that are explicitly designed to celebrate the thought and action that are moving communities forward towards sustainability. So again, this is designed to be both highly specific to an individual community, but generalizable in concept. So there are 6 sections. Next generation focuses on kids, neighbors, on neighborhoods, serving our community, on public organizations and nonprofits, heritage, on historic legacy, our downtown, on businesses, and then natural whatever, in our case natural Oberlin, on kind of green space within communities. So I'm just going to very quickly show you some sample content. There's a database that contains hundreds and hundreds of images and quotes from these. So at the neighborhood scale, what we're really trying to do here is to combine, is to take actions that are taken at the neighborhood scale, oftentimes by people who are not explicitly recognized as leaders, but who are exercising leadership within their local communities and feature those. So this is a woman, Valerie Hardnett, who was awarded a alternative transportation prize a couple years ago because she decided she was going to ride her bike everywhere. You see her on her bike everywhere. And we've gotten a lot of great content from her. I'll just read you this particular quote. Change is part of the environment. If you want the environment to survive for our grandchildren, we have to change the way that we live our lives. It's our responsibility. So again, sort of neighborhood scale. Heritage features the particular historical legacy within any community. Oberlin happens to be a community where bicycles are important. History with respect to Underground Railroad and African American issues is important. Gender rights are important. So these are things that are all featured with the intent of helping people understand that the challenges we faced in the past and overcome as a community are relevant to the challenges we face now, and we can sort of learn from those. So bicycles have always been a favorite way of getting around in Oberlin. Our downtown features things that people in the business community, so the sort of economic part of the sustainability puzzle here, very important in this section. Natural Oberlin featuring natural beauty. This is actually another quote from Valerie Hardnett, who I featured earlier. Riding your bike is very spiritual, you're getting closer to nature. Serving our community features, again, actions that are taken both by the government, local government, and by nonprofit organizations. Quote from one of our teachers there. One of the things that we think is most important in this, in the Community Voices section, is actions by kids, images and actions of kids. We have been operating with the assumption that kids have a special role as agents of change within communities, and that messages delivered by kids have the potential to reach adults in ways that similar messages delivered by adults might not. I'm going to say a little bit about research we've done on that in a second, but that's been one of our operating hypotheses. So I've already said we see delivering this through digital signage as being critical because you want to remove the barrier from people having access to these various modes of feedback. So on these digital signs installed in all of our public schools, several businesses downtown, retirement homes, public service agencies, we've got these digital signs that basically rotate between content. So they've got Citywide and building dashboards, community voices. They also have community calendars that people can post events on, and special features that are specific to where they're installed. So the public library has information about books that they want to feature on there. But we see that as very important. And then the website has a much richer, deeper level of content in it. But again, we see there being a bit of a barrier to get there. So this is very widely used within schools, the website, because you can get at and play with the data and download data and do things like that. We've done a lot of work in our public schools with the technology, trying to integrate it into the learning that takes place there. So focused on skills, on content, specifically on matching skills and content to new state and national standards. But we're particularly enthusiastic about the way in which this technology engages students in authentic learning experiences. They're really learning what's going on in their schools. We've done a lot of work also at college, at teaching at the college level. And I don't want to talk about this in detail, but just to say it has been integrated into a number of different courses and various independent research. A lot of the development, for instance, of content for community voices takes place in the context of courses. Students go out and interview community members. It gives them a reason to learn from the community, which is a very valuable experience for them. All right, I want to wrap this up by just giving you a taste of some of the research we've been doing on this. And this little piece is one we just received an NSF grant that's going to build on some of our work here. What we're trying to do is understand the degree to which displays like this actually do promote systems thinking. So this very strange looking comparison on the bottom are basically our control, where we delivered the same content with motion. That's Pac-Man in there, so you had Pac-Man just sort of chasing around. So it was visually engaging, but it didn't have a conceptual model of the city. And what we've shown in several different studies now is that exposure to Citywide dashboard enhances several dimensions of systems thinking. So we've developed a set of metrics for assessing systems thinking skills, and we found that we do in fact enhance it with Citywide dashboard. We've done that in a classroom context too, with 4th and 5th graders, and shown that we can improve content retention as well as systems thinking skills by integrating Citywide dashboard. The empathetic gauge, we've done work on that to show that people are in fact more impacted by an empathetic character than by a very nice, attractive looking alternate gauge. As I say, we've done quite a bit of work recently trying to assess the same messages delivered by kids versus adults. We thought we were going to get a slam dunk with this research, but it actually turns out to be a little bit hard to detect differences in the impact of messages on adults versus kids. And we're still trying to figure out whether there's less of an effect than we thought there would be, or whether we just haven't figured out how to ask questions in the right way. One place we have seen an effect is when people are exposed to the same message with kids versus adults, they're more inclined to say that they're going to engage in community-based activities like voting and participating in events. So that's kind of a cool piece of that, but that's very much still something we're working on. I didn't mention this directly, but as part of our development of feedback technology, we developed a technology called the environmental orb. This is a device that resides in residential environments. We have this installed in all of the dorms on the Oberlin College campus. Basically, this device glows different colors depending on how much electricity or water you're using. So this is an effort to develop technology which is less cognitively intense, doesn't require as much thinking skills, but still delivers information. And we found that exposure to orbs increases the degree to which people are thinking about resource use, as well as reducing levels of resource consumption. So green is good, and then it goes to red when you're using, basically this is based on your relative electricity use in this scale. If you're using twice as much electricity or more, it'll glow bright red. Half as much or less, it'll glow green, and it goes through a spectrum. Finally, last little piece of research is we've started a competition a long time ago at Oberlin, a competition among dorms to reduce electricity use. We collaborated with U.S. Green Building Council, National Wildlife Federation, Alliance to Save Energy to develop a national scale program called Campus Conservation Nationals. There are hundreds of schools that participate in this, thousands of students now, and we demonstrated significant reductions in electricity and water use in response to these competitions. And we have some data to suggest that that is sustained beyond the competition period, that they've taught themselves lessons that they continue to exhibit beyond there. This is actually a competition we have ending tomorrow in our public schools. Outrageous levels of electricity reductions in our schools. Prospect Elementary, which is where my daughter is at this very moment, is incredible. You walk into that school right now, and one of my, someone I have working for me on managing this project says, he walked in there one day and thought the school was closed because it was dark in there. The kids had convinced people to turn off the lights. I mean, that is crazy savings there, and they really are doing that. So just to sort of bring all this together, what we're trying to do is to develop a technology and an approach that really functions as something that connects a lot of what is sort of disparate groups of people within a community. So can we develop technologies that sort of make a link between these different components of our society, and then really foster this, this sort of mesh network of connections between these different players in decision making, fostering this sort of community level systems thinking. So just to close by saying, again, the thing we just got off the ground is this work at 4 other small liberal arts colleges and their communities, or 3 other small liberal arts colleges. We're trying to really use the technology as a way of connecting people on campuses, faculty, students, facilities people, sustainability people, connecting people between colleges, and their surrounding communities, and then connecting people among colleges. So that's sort of where we are right now, and I think I'm smack on time in terms of ending at half an hour from when I started, so I'd love to talk with you about anything that might have interested you in what I said. That's a really good, question, and I think there are kind of several angles to that question and several answers, so I'll probably answer part of them and then maybe you'll have to ask me again. In terms of the sort of, the confronting people with news they don't want to hear, which is part of what I heard, the sort of Ethiopian starving child, we pretty intentionally focused on sort of more on positive than on negative. That squirrel is as likely to be smiling as it is to be unhappy. The messages and community voices, we very intentionally include only messages that are about how we can move things forward. And we've actually had some complaints from community members, saying, well, why aren't you identifying, problems of poverty? The way we deal with things like that is to talk about the way people within our community are empowered and dealing with that. And part of it has to do with just an understanding that people are more likely to be motivated by a positive message than a negative message, but also I think it's a recognition of the nature of the media we're working in. We have public screens, so our job is really to create public screens that are engaging to an audience, and people are more likely to look at something if it's saying something positive about their community. So this notion of really emphasizing the development of a pro-environmental identity, where the social norms, they see someone on the screen and say, I didn't think that person was an environmental person, but they're being celebrated for their environmental action. I'm taking many of the same actions that they're taking. I guess maybe I'm that person. Maybe that's, and the people who are celebrated themselves saying, I'm being celebrated for this action I'm taking. I hadn't really thought about these other things I'm doing in my life, but now I'm experiencing what psychologists would say cognitive dissonance, because I've got other things in my life that I'm not doing that. And I should also say, in answer to your question, we definitely value, my closest partner on this is a social psychologist, so we very much value understanding psychological response, and we have a lot of beginnings of research and completed research trying to really quantify the extent to which people might be habituating, which is, I think, one of your concerns, and these other things. Some of these things are just going to take a long time, because this is a pretty, when you think about a whole community, and our treatment here is exposure to digital signage. You need a lot of exposure before you're going to be able to measure an effect. And so we feel like we actually need to have it out there for a couple of years before we're going to get really meaningful results. So I think I answered many of your questions, although perhaps not all of them. Yeah, when you say people, you mean sort of municipalities, government figures, that sort of thing. It certainly has been a slog. I feel like parts of it are because we're doing it for the first time, and so people are asking the question, well, why the heck would you want to do that? But like some of this, once you have a community or two that has this and you can point towards them, you do need to think about, at some level, what's in it for people, for these people. And I think if you can create a situation in which you have a public that understands infrastructure better and understands the value of infrastructure, I think people who are involved in supporting that infrastructure see it as a way of, of the citizenry valuing what they're doing. Again, the positive messages, trying to stay very pro-environmental, but at the same time apolitical, is very important, I think, for garnering support. You want this to be apple pie, stealth apple pie, let's say, because you do need, basically, to make this work, you need support. But there are different reasons why different people might be in it. For instance, when we install it in a local coffee shop, they get to put their content on that sign too, and the message that they essentially get to convey to people is, we are concerned about the community, we're part of this, environmental thing that's going on in our community, and hey, we've got some great deals on, sandwiches. So that something's in it for them too. So there's definitely, there's obviously a lot of politics that one needs to deal with, and that's part of why we have so explicitly tried not to put explicit political messages on here. So far, people have pretty much treated it like it's apple pie in our community. Like, this is one of the few things where we have meetings between people at the college and people in the community where there's no one griping about the relationship between the college and the community. They're all like, yes, they own it. You want everyone in the community to feel like they own this. This is theirs. And again, the interviews really help. If you're interviewing everyone and sharing their content up here, everyone you've interviewed owns this. It's theirs. So I don't know if I completely answered your question, but I think I partly did. Great questions. My answer to the second one might not be entirely satisfactory, but let me start with the first one, if I can remember the first one.
The messaging, like what's the after?
Right. So I think what we have here is kind of a, obviously there's this literature on community-based social marketing. Doug McKenzie Moore is sort of leading figure, social psychologist within that, who focuses very much on what you're talking about is what is the best message for getting the desired outcome. What we're doing here is actually consistent but also radically different from that in the sense that what we're trying to do is build on local knowledge with this. So we filter content, but we're interviewing the public. So all of the content on Community Voices is drawn from conversations with the public, identifying what they care about. We filter it in the sense we're deciding ultimately what's up there, but it is all crowdsourced information in that sense. And in some ways, we'd like to further develop the technology so ultimately citizens could actually do the filtering as well. So it's a little different in the sense that we're not marketing in the way that normal people would market. We're reversing that. And it involves trust, obviously. It's a little bit more like Wikipedia, I think, in terms of how ultimately the content is there. And I think Wikipedia has to some extent proved itself in the sense that I think there have been tests that demonstrate it's about as accurate as an encyclopedia because it's got this filtration process of people who care about these issues looking and filtering it out. We're not quite there yet. We actually filter all the content ourselves. It's all gathered from the community. So we are actually we're deciding what questions we ask people to try to elicit content we care about. But you understand what I'm saying? It's different from normal marketing in us making a full decision about what's up there and what's important. We want the community to be integrally deciding and engaged in what's important. And we're trying to show, we'll take what's good and put it up there. We might not be doing the best job of saying objectively from a scientific standpoint what's the most important stuff. It's kind of radically different too in the way our students are engaging with the public because most students who are learning about environmental stuff and engaged with the larger community, their tendency is to take what they learn in the classroom and think of themselves as dissemination devices where they are the people with knowledge and they're communicating that knowledge to the public. We have completely stood that model on its head and said, your job as a student is to go out there and find out what the community knows, what they've learned, and bring that back to us so we can then put that back to the community. And that changes the relationship. People don't look at the dashboard as being the college stuffing its information at us. They look at it as this is us. So that really transforms that relationship. So it's a complicated answer to your question, and now I've lost your second question.
Oh, just things that there's a long time lag.
Oh, time lag. I think that, fundamentally this is about storytelling. I think you can find ways to tell stories that have a longer term time scale. When I think about like the Citywide dashboard and it having those gauges on the right, I don't actually care whether people fully understand the meaning of the numbers in there. What I want them to understand is that those numbers change all the time and that what they do affects those numbers. So my goal is less to make people quantitatively literate and more to sort of help them to understand that these individual actions really are connected with a larger whole. I think if you combine that with Community Voices content, in which you interview people who can talk about the long-term effects, people who talk about, what they remember in terms of lake water quality from the past and what it looks like now, what they've seen in their lifetime, things they've seen in terms of changing climate, I think you can extract the stories which will allow you to get where you want. Yeah, and it's a great question, and I would say, the evolution of our project really was more along the lines of what can you gather data to measure, and then how, so we sort of started with what could we gather in real time, and obviously things like biodiversity, they're a little harder to gather that data, and that's part of the reason we build Community Voices in as such a central part, because it allows you to tell a lot of these stories that are just more, there's no stream of data, or at least not that I'm aware of, that allows you to inject that so easily. But, hey, we've just done what we've done. It's not like there aren't 1,000 other directions that are important to head in. I thought you were going to say, why aren't you including solid waste in there? And then my answer to that was going to be, because we don't have the data stream. But if we did have the data stream, we should be including solid waste in there. But these things that are harder to measure, I think, I don't know how they get in there. I don't know, but I think they're important to get in there. Yes, citizen science. Yeah, and in some ways I really see Community Voices being about, at least it's the crowdsourcing of messaging. They're exactly what you saw. They're static images with text associated with them, and we have mostly students. We're actually moving towards a situation where we're going to have kids in the public schools developing some of that content, because we think that would be a very, very powerful experience for them. To do that, we're going to start piloting that this summer, but it's all interviews conducted, and then we have a database with the photos in it, and every photo is given a certain probability of showing up, and on different screens you can set different probabilities for different content and stuff. So there's a lot of sort of back-end management, but at the end of the day, it's just a database with photos and text in it, and it will put the stuff up there. Yeah, it's a very good question. So I'll answer your second question, then you may need to remind me about the first question. We have taken different strategies. We've been running these energy competitions since 2006. So we've tried a bunch of different strategies, and we've also interviewed people, done extensive survey work at other schools. Different people take very different strategies. Initially, we were very interested in sort of self-organization. If you provide people with feedback, it just gives them the information. How do they teach themselves how to conserve? And we got some interesting results where we saw, for instance, in our first publication on this anyway, our two winning dorms, one of them was sending emails around, with lots of people were sharing emails about how they were, what they were doing. And the other dorm, which did equally well, were meeting once a week, face to face. And so you had two very different approaches to thinking about it. But we were told, we didn't give them any suggestions in that one. All we did was give them information and said, you figure it out. There are lots of other schools that have concurrently run education campaigns to say this is what you can do to do that. So there are different approaches one might take to that. What was your first question?
Well, the first one was about the ratio, if there is a ratio.
Oh, right.
Positive, negative.
Right. It's not like we have fixed rules, except we don't want to put really negative content up there. I think what you'd find is a lot of our content is more sort of observational than it is necessarily positive. But most of the content really is a message about I'm doing something or I care about something. Yeah, so most of it is, and I think, again, we've decided to do that because a couple of reasons. The political reason is I don't think we'd last very long if we started putting negative messages up. Everyone wants to have these signs. I don't think they would if we started putting negative, and I also just think it's the wrong context for it. I'm all for people getting engaged in civil disobedience against things they don't like. I just feel like the second we begin to enter that space, we're not apple pie anymore and we're shut down. But also, there's plenty of data from social psychology saying people are more likely to respond to a positive message than a negative message. So, and I don't want to make any claims that what we're doing is the solution to environmental problems. The only thing that the way I view it is this is an angle on trying to get people into a space in which they can do things. And I will also say that we're interested in individual behavior, but we're actually, in terms of whether people are turning light switches on and off, we're just as interested in whether people are voting. So we do want to get a broad enough content so people really, so the emphasis is very much on citizen engagement and not just on, individual behaviors you might exhibit. We're interested in those too, but we really want it to be every bit as much about community.
Thank you.
So I'm wondering about the community voices part of it. You've taken the approach of going out and interviewing. Did you try or have you thought at all about kind of crowdsourcing that? So I've been talking to people about a project I have going on about basically creating some sort of web interface or some interface where people can share their stories either by written text or by submitting videos or things like that. And I'm wondering if you have any experience or thoughts on that.
I think it's a great idea. I'd like to have some of our content coming from that. We haven't gotten there. I'd love for us. I mean, we have a little bit of a project right now where people are making personal commitments related to climate change, and we're going to use content gathered from that. So I think that's our first foray into doing it online. I think that's great. I think it's a good approach. I think we should be doing that. We aren't doing that yet. I still think there's probably going to be a good place for interviews, because one of the things that we found is very often, this has been particularly true with the Our Downtown section where we're interviewing businesses. The first thing a business person almost always says to us when we interview them is, I'm not really doing anything on that sustainability thing. And then you talk with them for 10 minutes and you discover they've done all sorts of stuff, actually. They've replaced their lighting, they've done all these things. They just aren't thinking about it that way. So part of what we're trying to do is to discover things. Many people don't identify themselves as pro-environmental, in an explicit way. Turns out a lot of their individual actions they probably have a lot of individual actions which are most certainly not that way. But if we take those actions that are, we celebrate them for it, again, I think for those people, we begin to create an identity for them. You're being celebrated for being a leader on something. They're not going to want the rest of what they're doing in their lives to feel inconsistent with what they're being celebrated for. So I think all of these things are, again, this is just a particular approach. We're not done. We don't feel like we've been comprehensive in our approach. It's it's where we are.
So let's thank John again, and thank you all for this great